Namaskar, you are welcome to your platform, the New Lyceum for English Literature. And in the series of literary criticism, we have come now to the Victorian period, and the best and most significant and most important critic of the Victorian period was the poet as well as the critic, and he was the professor of poetry at Oxford University as well, and his name was none other than Matthew Arnold. In today's class, we will talk about, I will talk about Matthew Arnold and his criticism. He is so vast, so big giant in the field of criticism that he cannot be summarized in a single class. So for the sake of convenience, I have divided his criticism into two parts. In today's lecture, I'll be talking about his preface to his poems and his lectures on translating Homer and then function of criticism. And in the second lecture that I'll be giving you, that will be focused on his magnum opus, the study of poetry, where he defines poetry and where he gives his comments on several poets. Right, so in today's class, only his preface to the poems of 1853, essays of criticism, and then his lectures on his book on translating Homer, then a short note on his book The Culture and Anarchy. In fact, that was a book of political essays, but it's also important for you, for the literature students. Alright, so let's begin with the introduction. Matthew Arnold doesn't require any introduction. In fact, he is a poet, he is a critic, he is a professor, he is an essayist, and Matthew Arnold is said to be the first modern critic. Right, he is said to be the first modern critic, and apart from it, for the first modern critic, he is also known as Critic's critic. Critics के critic कहा जाता है मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड को. Matthew Arnold is known as Critic's critic, and he is the first modern critic, and he was the critic who inspired the first half of the 20th century criticism, especially Thomas Stearns Eliot and F.R. Lewis. Right, his Ellen Tate, who founded his theory of tension, and that theory of tension was based on Matthew Arnold's criticism. Matthew Arnold was the first one who started the new criticism. The formalistic criticism was started by Matthew Arnold, and it was later forwarded by T.S. Eliot and other critics. That's why he is known as the first modern critic, and he is the critic's critic. Alright. Introduction. As I told you, Matthew Arnold, the Victorian poet and critic, was the first modern critic and could be called the critic's critic, being a champion not only of great poetry but of literary criticism all. And what was the function of literary criticism? Matthew Arnold defines in his essay the function of criticism at the present time, and what should be the function of a critic. He describes what should be the purpose, what should be the function of a poet. He describes in his essays, and his focus is on society. So Matthew Arnold is known as a sociological critic कहे जाते हैं Matthew Arnold. He was the founder of sociological school of criticism, and through his touchstone method, about which he talks about in his essay, the study of poetry, that was later published in the essay on criticism in the second series. That touchstone method is the root of comparative criticism. Earlier Dryden had also talked about comparative criticism in his essay on dramatic poesy, where you had seen that there were 4 interlocutors and they were delivering lectures in support of either Greek drama or French drama, or English drama or new drama. Here Mr. Matthew Arnold gives the concept of touchstone, and that touchstone are the lines from the few classical as well as English poets. If you want to evaluate your poetry, if you want to judge your poetry, compare your lines with the lines of those great writers, and if they are equal, it means you are a great poet, and if they are not, it means you are a mean poet. That I'll be talking about in my next lecture on Matthew Arnold. Today I'm talking about his role as a sociological critic. He is said to be the founder of sociological school of criticism, and through his touchstone method introduced scientific objectivity to critical evaluation by providing comparisons and analysis as the two primary tools of criticism. The next question arises from here: what are the two primary tools of criticism according to Matthew Arnold? The two primary tools of criticism are, according to Matthew Arnold, analysis, and the second one, comparison. Comparison and analysis as the two primary tools of criticism. Arnold's evaluation of the romantic poets such as Wordsworth, Byron, Shelley and Keats are landmark in descriptive criticism, and as a poet critic he occupies an eminent position in the rich galaxy of poet critics of English literature. Right, and essay on John Keats, essay on Shelley, essay on Wordsworth, essay on Byron. These essays, these are the fragments that are found in his study of poetry. Right, sociological criticism, critic's critic, first modern critic, the inspirer, the influencer of the first half of the 20th century criticism, inspirer, influencer of the new criticism, inspirer of the formalistic criticism, and the father of objective criticism. Right, father of objective criticism. According to Matthew Arnold, while judging a piece of literature, we should not be psychologically, biographically or economically influenced by anyone. We should judge a work of literature, a work of poetry, a work of fiction disinterestedly. He talks about disinterestedness, he talks about neutrality, and you should judge a work with complete disinterestedness, with unprejudicedness. This is the objective of Matthew Arnold's criticism. Alright, just keep on making your notes one by one. All these points are very, very, very important. Alright, and next, the social role of poetry and criticism. What should be the role of poetry and what should be the role of criticism? According to Matthew Arnold, if you are living in a society and nobody can live out of the society, and if you are the part of the society, then you must focus on society. Your literature should be social and your criticism should also be social. Without society, your existence, the existence of literature, the existence of criticism is cannot be supposed. सोचा ही नहीं जा सकता है. In his view, the creative artist, no matter how much of a genius, would cut a sorry figure without the critic to come to his aid. According to William Wordsworth, a critic is lesser than a poet, than a creator. Creator is stronger than the critic, as was said by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth thinks that man of creator has more potential, has more power than the critic. To criticize someone is the meanest task, and to create something is the highest, uppermost task. But Matthew Arnold doesn't agree with him. According to Matthew Arnold, creativity is not as important as the criticism. Creativity is fine, okay, you are good, be a creator, but without criticism, you will not be known. Your message cannot be spread. Your message is spread through your criticism. Alright, Matthew Arnold said that it's to be a mean poet than a greater critic. And Matthew Arnold says that it's better to be a greater critic than a meaner poet. Right, and he gives examples from the entire field of literature. I'll be coming to you in a short while on this topic. Before Arnold, a literary critic cared only for the beauties and defects of work. Right, beauties and defects of works of art were analyzed before the arrival of Matthew Arnold as a critic. Once Matthew Arnold enters the field of criticism, Arnold, the critic, chose to be the educator and guardian of public opinion and propagator of the best ideas. For Matthew Arnold, a critic is a social figure, and the basic purpose of the social figure is to educate. According to Wordsworth, the purpose of poet was to educate, but Matthew Arnold thinks that the purpose of a critic is to be the educator and the guardian of public opinion. He must be the guardian of public opinion. Public opinion must not go waste. They should be taken together, and it is the duty of the critic to gather the public opinion and collect those opinions in a single text, in a single work. That is called criticism. Right? Propagator of the best ideas. He should not only collect, but he should propagate those best ideas. Right? Those best ideas. And if the atmosphere is not fine during the Victorian industrialization, Matthew Arnold thinks that everybody was thinking in the materialistic term. As the Wordsworth had written a poem, the world is too much with us. And if everybody is thinking in the materialistic terms, everybody is becoming selfish, then it is not the environment to write good literature, to write good poetry. And if there is no environment of producing such great works, then what should a person do? Then a person should be a critic, and then he should create an atmosphere. एक माहौल बनाना चाहिए so that the poetry could be written. Right? Poets like Homer, poets like Dante, poets like Shakespeare, poets like Milton could come out if the atmosphere is prepared by the critics. And this is the duty of the critic. Means critic is the part of society. He must be social, and then he should work for the social uplift. He should work for social upgradation, and social opinions must be collected and then propagated. इसलिए one of the critics has described Matthew Arnold as a propagandist. And now I give you this question. You have to find out the right answer and write the answer in the comment box section. Who called Mr. Matthew Arnold as a propagandist? As he talked about the propagation of the best ideas. Alright, cultural and critical values seem to be synonymous for Arnold. Cultural values, cultural criticism and literary criticism are equal in the eyes of Mr. Matthew Arnold. Oh, Scott James wrote a book, Making of English Literature. And in Making of English Literature, very significant book, very important book for the student of UGC NET who is aspiring to be an assistant professor. Very important book. Scott James described Matthew Arnold. He compared Matthew Arnold with the greatest critic of the world, Aristotle. उससे compare करता है. Comparing him to Aristotle says that where Aristotle analyzes the work of art. Aristotle analyzes the work of art. Arnold analyzes not the work of art, but the role of the critic. Role of the critic. What should be the role of the critic? Aristotle analyzes the work of art. Arnold analyzes the work, the function, the role of the critic. Aristotle gives us the principles, the formulas, the rules, the regulations which governed the making of a poem, and Matthew Arnold gives us the principles by which the best poems should be selected and made known. How to write a poem? This is the task of Aristotle. And how to choose the best poem? This is the task of Matthew Arnold's criticism. Clear हो रहा है ना point? कोई confusion होगी तो sure comment box is open for you. Matthew Arnold decides the role of the critic. Matthew Arnold formulates the theory how to pick the best poem among many poems. कैसे among many poems में से एक poem choose किया जाए. Right? Aristotle talks about the principles of making a poem, and Matthew Arnold talks about principles of selecting a poem and making it known to the world. Aristotle's critic vows allegiance to the artist, but Arnold's critic has a duty to society. Arnold's critic is responsible for the society, and Matthew Arnold's critic is responsible for the society, and Aristotelian followers are not responsible for society but for the artist, for the art. All right, fine. Any confusion? Any issue? Nothing? Nothing? तो फिर just touch the button of like, touch the button of subscribe, and touch also the button of share. Share the video with other students so that they also could get the benefit of this lecture. All right, keep on pressing the liking button and keep on forwarding the video. The social critic, and then after he compares poetry with philosophy, science and religion. Philosophy, science and religion, this is science. Alright, this is the best example of science. For to Arnold, poetry itself was the criticism of life. Poetry itself was the criticism of life. The criticism of life under the conditions fixed for such criticism. Fixed for such criticism by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty. And in his seminal essay, The Study of Poetry, he says that poetry alone can be our sustenance and stay in an era where religious beliefs are fast losing their hold. Victorian period was the time when religion was losing their place. Science was advancing very fast, leap and bound, very progressively. And the book that was published in 1859, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, it has created a great furor in Europe. It has questioned the God. And कैसे question किया था? Man is not the divine phenomena, man is not the divine development, but it is the theory of evolution. He has evolved from a boneless species to a human. God doesn't have any role, and it has challenged entire European philosophies, European theologians. And Matthew Arnold wrote a poem, Dover Beach, and in Dover Beach he says, he gives the example of Sophocles. Long ago, Sophocles had heard this voice on the Aegean, right? So religion was losing its ground, and once religion was losing its ground, philosophies were becoming weaker. Philosophies were becoming weaker. Science was progressing leaps and bounds. So there was no place, no scope for great poetry as Mr. Arnold thinks. Right? Religious beliefs are fast losing their hold. Only poetry can save us. Only poetry can save us from this selfish world. Religion, he claims that poetry is superior to philosophy, science and religion. Religion attaches its emotion to supposed facts. Religion attaches its emotion to supposed facts. And the supposed facts are failing. Religion तो कहता है ना God है, that is supposed fact. Nobody has ever met him, and that supposed fact is losing its ground. But poetry attaches its emotion to ideas, and ideas are infallible. Ideas are infallible since the time of Plato, since the time of inception of this humanity, since the time of inception of criticism. Ideas are infallible. Poetries are made of ideas, so poetry has more power to retain, to sustain itself. And religion is losing its ground because emotion जो है, right? Religion attached the emotion to the supposed facts, and supposed facts are losing their ground. Poetry attaches its emotion to ideas, and ideas are infallible. They cannot be dismissed. They cannot be summarily, categorically discarded. They will remain. Ideas will remain. Supposed facts are losing the ground in the era of industrialization, in the era of scientific advancement, in the era of progression. Everything that is based on supposed facts has no value, right? सब अपनी जमीन खोए दे रहे हैं. And science, in the view of Matthew Arnold, is incomplete without poetry. And if you talk about India, Indian science, whether it is medical science, whether it's engineering science, any type of science, everything is written in the form of poetry, and that poetry is based on ideas. That's why Indian culture, Indian literature, they are infallible, right? He endorses Wordsworth's view that poetry is the impassioned expression which is the countenance of all science. Poetry, what is poetry? Poetry is impassioned expression, right? Poetry is impassioned expression, and that impassioned expression is the countenance of all science, adding what is a countenance without its expression, and calls poetry the breathe and finer spirit of all knowledge. Wordsworth had said that poetry is the breathe and finer spirit of all knowledge, and here Matthew Arnold agrees with the theory of William Wordsworth. Though Matthew Arnold was the harsh critic of William Wordsworth, but according to Mr. Matthew Arnold, the best should be propagated. The best should be propagated, should be known to the world, should be spread, should be disseminated. And what was the best in Wordsworth was being disseminated by Matthew Arnold through his criticism. For him, for Wordsworth, poetry is the impassioned expression, and that impassioned expression is the backbone of science. And poetry without science, or science without poetry, is incomplete. Poetry is the breath of finer spirit of knowledge, and science is knowledge. Without breath, how can knowledge survive? So poetry is mandatory, right? Poetry is more important than philosophy, than science, than religion, right? Matthew Arnold discards all these area of research, area of writing, compares poetry with philosophy, science and religion, and finally poetry proves to be superior. Alright? Matthew Arnold was in fact a moralist, right? He was in fact a moralist, and entire Victorianism was a moralist. How Matthew Arnold became a critic? The father of Matthew Arnold, Mr. Thomas Arnold, was the famous headmaster of the rugby school. And on the death of his father, Matthew Arnold had written an elegy under the title Rugby Chapel. Matthew Arnold's father was a headmaster of the school, and Mr. Matthew Arnold became the professor of poetry. He wrote his poems, and his poems were published first time under the title Empedocles on Aegina and other poems. During the time when Matthew Arnold was writing, there was a group of school named Spasmodic School of Poets. Spasmodic School of Poets. It was a group, and you will never find this group on you Google or in any other book. So please remember or write the name of these poets. And these poets believe in what? These poets believed in the present culture, present subject matter of the poetry. And Mr. Matthew Arnold said that the present condition of England is not good for poetry, and it is not the duty of poetry to take the raw material from the present. So Matthew Arnold gives a comparison between the classical poetry and the present poetry that was spearheaded by these spasmodic schools of poetry. Right? They said they believed that the present condition is not good for poetry, but by using excessive simile, by using excessive metaphor, by using excessive ornaments or excessive figure of speech, they can compete with the classical poets. And Matthew Arnold was against this formula, against this belief. That's why when the second edition of his poem Empedocles on Aegina and other poems arrived, published in 1853, he had deleted the poem, the title poem, on the ground that it lacks morality. It lacks morality, and this poem is not fit for the society, and on that ground he had deleted the poem. Alright, Spasmodic School of Poets consisted of Philip James Bailey, Sidney Duvall, Alexander Smith, Richard Hengist Horn, John Stannin Bigg, Gerald Massey, George Gilfillan, William McGonagall, John Westland Marston, and Ebenjo Jones. These were the important poets of this school, Spasmodic. But Mr. Matthew Arnold was not the member of this school, but he was anti-Spasmodic. That's why he is important here. Spasmodic school is important here because Matthew Arnold's critical theories developed against the ideas of this Spasmodic school. They held poetry to be the expression of the state of one's mind in striking language. State of one's mind in striking language means whatever comes into your mind, you are free to write, but your language should be striking. So in a way you could say, you can just assume that these Spasmodic poets were against Wordsworth's theory of poetry. Wordsworth was talking that poetry should be written in the language of common man, and a poet should be a man speaking to a man, right? And these Spasmodics, they deviated, they rejected, they refuted Wordsworthian theory, and they said that you could write your mind in striking language, in very highly rhetorical language, in very figurative language, ornamental language. And Mr. William Wordsworth's theory, then Spasmodic, and then Matthew Arnold once again goes against this theory. Matthew Arnold says no, ugliness cannot be hidden through by pigmentation. ऐसा नहीं हो सकता कि कोई क्रो जो है कौवा बगुला बन जाए, पिगमेंटेशंस, ऐसा नहीं हो सकता. तो जो कंटेंट हमारा इस टाइम का है, that is vast. The situation, the atmosphere, actually one other French critic had said that literature is made of three things: race, movement, and milieu. And Mr. Matthew Arnold followed his theory. Matthew Arnold goes on the footstep of Taine and says that the milieu is not fit for poetry at this time, and since this movement milieu is not fit, atmosphere is not okay, atmosphere is not fine, then we should not take the raw material from our society. Where should we go? We should go to the classics. We should raw material from the classics. That's why Mr. Matthew Arnold is also said to be the classicist critic, right? He is known to be the classicist critic, and this theory that we are free to write whatever comes in our mind in a striking language, this led on the other hand to an extravagance of thought and emotion, and on the other to a provoking excess of metaphor. At their highest, however, they did succeed, expressing the doubts, disputes, distractions, and fears of their age in a language which, with all its bombast, was not without appeal to their generation. These spasmodics were not complete failure. They succeeded to a certain extent in their attempt in writing their own mind in very striking language. They succeeded to a certain extent, but that success was not permanent. That success was short-lived. That success was temporary, and very soon it was summarily rejected. A few important poets were also trapped, like Matthew Arnold himself. Matthew Arnold himself wrote Empedocles on Athena on this pattern. Mr. Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote a poem Maud, M-A-U-D, Maud, a poem on this pattern only. And Mr. Henry Hallam had also written a poem on this pattern, right? So these poets were also inspired by the spasmodic critics, spasmodic poets, but they later realized that they were not on the right track. Spasmodic poets basically focused on dramatic poetry, dramatic narration. Tennyson, otherwise so afraid of ungoverned passion and so careful an artist, followed them in Maud, and Arnold, who was soon to lead the revolt against them, unwittingly did the same in Empedocles on Athena, and as soon as he realized, he deleted the poem from his next edition, from the next publication. Alright, are getting my point? Any confusion? No confusion? No study, no confusion. More study, more confusion. Keep on watching my lectures, and these lectures will be very fruitful to you if you watch each and every lecture with complete attention. You are not going to find all these lectures at one place anywhere, right? These all lectures are prepared from the UGC NET's perspective, from the students of MA उनके perspective से, and from the perspectives of a teacher and student as well, right? If you are a teacher and if you have to teach Matthew Arnold in your next class, you can watch this video before going to the class, and in the class you will have everything to deliver. If you are a student, if you are watching this video for your MA examination, you have to write your MA examination, you will get you will get everything here from this video. If you are preparing for UGC NET examination, this is the best place for you, right? Best place for you. I guarantee, इसलिए मैं guarantee लेता हूँ, I have much experience in this field. I have taught, I have guided to the students of UGC NET for 15 years. And hundreds of my students have got selection. They are working as assistant professors in different colleges, different even universities, and many are working as a lecturer in different inter-colleges, different secondary schools, in government as well as in highly like a DPS type school, right? If you are listening to me attentively, then you cannot be defeated. You are going to be unconquerable once you watch complete videos, right? You are going to crack your examination this year only if you are listening to me attentively and making notes accordingly. My Telegram channel is also open for you. You can join the Telegram channel under the head the New Lyceum for English Literature, or you could also search English Literature with Dr. J.K. Tiwari, and you will get all the notes there, right? You will get all the notes there that are relevant, that are exclusive for your UGC NET examination. And even you will get all these PPTs that I am teaching here. You will get everything from the Telegram channel, and a lot of questions as well, or MCQs, PYQs. Okay, let's proceed after the break. Arnold's critical works. What were the works that come under the umbrella of criticism written by Matthew Arnold? Preface to the poems of 1853, on translating Homer, the study of Celtic literature, essays in criticism in 2 volumes, and culture and anarchy, an essay in political and social criticism. Just write down the names of these books, and then I shall proceed. Finished. Let's see first Matthew Arnold as a classicist, his criticism on poetry. You can see the picture of Matthew Arnold and the purpose of art. He quotes a French philosopher, a French critic, Schiller, saying that for all art is dedicated to joy. All art is dedicated to joy, and Mr. Matthew Arnold himself is a melancholic poet, is a pessimist poet. And Arnold says that even tragedy, which has suffering for its theme, is no exception to this. We watch tragedy for what purpose? We watch tragedy to get entertainment, to enjoy. The purpose of literature is to enjoy. Right, for the suffering in it is one from which men can derive enjoyment. Suffering magnificently, though vainly resisted, not one unrelieved by incident, hope or resistance, in which there is everything to be endured, nothing to be done. To Arnold, as to Aristotle, the joy that poetry imparts is dependent on the subject. The joy that poetry provides is dependent on its subject, and what should be the subject I told you earlier. And once again I am going to describe Matthew Arnold's opinion as a critic, as a classicist. Ancient versus modern controversy. Ancient versus modern controversy was also the part of neoclassical criticism, where you had seen the battle of the books between ancient and moderns. Ancients were preferred there. Here again, when literature comes in the Victorian period, the controversy of ancient and modern still persists. And once again, Matthew Arnold emphasized the importance of classicists, not the modernists. Classicist means Homer, Dante, Virgil, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristotle, Plato, right? Pindar, Horace, Juvenal, they are all known as classicists. Contemporary, Matthew Arnold's contemporary, Tennyson, Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Charles Dickens, Thomas Hardy, they were the moderns. And the main spasmodics were also the modern. And Matthew Arnold suggests that we should not take the raw material from the present society, but we should go back to the past, to our classical masters for the material, as the present age is not suitable for the poetry. And that's why I say that Mr. Arnold was a classicist. The spasmodics believed that the ancient subjects had their day, and that it was the business of the modern poet to choose the modern subjects. This was the contention against which Mr. Arnold speaks. Mr. Arnold was provoked against such ideas. Arnold, painfully aware of the havoc wrought by science and industrial revolution in his age, thought otherwise. Right, Mr. Matthew Arnold was very sensitive, and when he saw that religion was being discarded, the ideas were being discarded, right, the facts were being discarded, then he was aware of the havoc wrought by science. He thought something different, and according to Matthew Arnold, the business of the poet is not to praise their age only, as poet is not made for the age, a poet is universal. The business of the poet is not to praise their age, but to afford to the men who live in it the highest pleasure which they are capable of feeling. The purpose, the business of poet is to please the audience, to give the audience the highest pleasure. कितना pleasure जितने के लिए वो capable है according to his capacity. If asked to afford this by means of subjects drawn from the age itself, they ask what special fitness the present age has. The present age has no fitness at all. What special fitness the present age has for supplying them? They are told that it is an era of progress, an age of commissioned to carry out the great ideas of industrial development and social amelioration. They reply that with all this they can do nothing, that the elements they need for the exercise of their art are great actions calculated powerfully and delightfully to affect what is permanent in the human soul. Right, he talks about the permanency, he talks about the great action, he talks about the classicals, he talks about the insignificant subject matter of the age, he talks about the havoc of the industrial revolution, he talks about the havoc of the scientific advancement, scientific development. He was very sad, he was very melancholic on such progress, so he does not want to stay in his own age, at least as far as poetry is concerned, art is concerned, criticism is concerned. All right. Yes. What is right, what is wrong, accent and expression. What should be there in the poetry? According to Arnold, there should be accent, and according to Spasmodics, there must be narration. That's why I said that Spasmodics believes in dramatic narration, dramatic verse. Greeks wisely left them to be treated by the comic poet. Narration was the expression, was the subject matter of the comic poet, not the serious poet of the time. For tragedy, which they considered the highest form of poetry, they chose accent that always please and please all. Accents are important. As Aristotle had said, tragedy is an imitation of an accent that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. In language embellished with all kinds of, each kind of artistic ornament, several parts being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, not of narration. Aristotle was emphasizing on action, not of narrative. In the same way, Matthew Arnold says here that the classical poets found pleasure in action rather than narration, and we have to shift to the classical age, to the classical period. All right. So, accents that are of this nature that most powerfully appeal to those elementary feelings which are independent of time are the fittest subject for poetry. Right? Fittest subject of poetry is action, not of narration. It is immaterial whether they are ancient or modern, so long as they satisfy this test of abiding appeal. But an age wanting in moral grandeur, says Arnold with reference to his own age, can with difficulty supply such. Poetry aims higher, poetry is cathartic. The age of Matthew Arnold, the Victorian England, is the age wanting in moral grandeur. Matthew Arnold says that if there is action, there is no matter whether the subject matter is ancient or modern, so long as they satisfy the test of abiding appeal. But an age wanting in moral grandeur cannot provide the subject for good poetry. It is the immoral age, and poetry must be moral. The message of the poetry is to give moral. Right? Moral मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड का भी पर्पस है और यही पर्पस मिस्टर वर्ड्सवर्थ का भी था. मिस्टर मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड is a moralist in critic. As a critic, he is a classical, he is a classicist, and he is a moralist. Ancient versus modern controversy, Mr. Arnold prefers ancient subjects, classical subjects, but if he says that it is immaterial whether they are ancient or modern, so long as they satisfy this test of abiding appeal, right? But the age is immoral age, and this immoral age cannot supply such material. Poetry aims higher, it is cathartic, and the message that the present age is giving is not cathartic, is not moral. Alright, right, wrong, wrong, right, right, wrong, right, wrong, wrong, right. This is the confusion, this is the dilemma of the time, and the dilemma is being expressed through this picture. Right, which is right, which is wrong, and finally the question mark. The age of Matthew Arnold, once again he says that this is the age of spiritual weakness. Because people have become selfish, the whole attention of the industrialist is to gain money, and money could be gained at the cost of suffering of others, and that's why there is no spirituality. And in the age of spiritual weakness, you once again cannot find the content for your poetry. Then romantic versus classical. Present versus classical. Classical is preferred, and then romantic versus classical. What is the main essence of romanticism? Main essence of romanticism is subjectivity, is individuality, is liberty from the restrictions of the previous era, preceding era's rules, regimentations, regulations. And classical means something high class. Which one is preferred here? Arnold turns his back on the prevailing romantic view of poetry and seeks to revive the classical values of objectivity. Right? He wants to shed, he wants to get rid of the subjectivity of the poetry, as Mr. John Keats had said that Wordsworth's poetry is egotistical poetry, and he even coined the phrase egotistical sublime or Wordsworthian sublime. Matthew Arnold says that there must not be any subjectivity in poetry. Poetry must be objective, as was Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, Dante's Divine Commedia. There should not be any point of subjectivity. And Mr. T.S. Eliot advances from this point. Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality. वो escape जो है यहाँ मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड स्टार्ट कर रहे हैं, जो आगे जाकर के न्यू क्रिटिसिज्म की बैकबोन बनता है। पोएट्री लिटरेचर शुड बी जज्ड नॉट ऑन द ग्राउंड्स ऑफ history, not on the grounds of philosophy, not on the ground of economic circumstances, but it should be judged as it is. This is the objectivity. There must not be any subjectivity. Values of subjectivity should be discarded and values of objectivity should be restored. Urbanity and architectonics must be restored. What is architectonic? You will know just after this slide. He denounces the romantics for ignoring classical writers for the sake of novelty. Mr. Wordsworth was always in favor of newness, always in favor of novelty, and a new thing is not always a good thing. New thing, if something is new, it doesn't mean it's good. For example, थोड़ी politics में नहीं जाना है. He denounces the romantics for ignoring the classical writers for the sake of novelty and for their elusive. Arnold uses the word suggestive writing, which defies easy comprehension. Poetry must be elusive. Poetry must be a bit complicated. Poetry must not be easy, as poetry is not for all. It must have certain suggestivity. It must have certain elusiveness. And you should not sacrifice the classical values for the sake of newness only, for the sake of novelty. So he was against the romantic values, right? Who? Matthew Arnold, the critic about whom you are listening this lecture, right? Just see the image. Who is classicist and who is the romantic? Take action. Action versus expression. Action and expression, and action versus expression. What should be preferred? What is more important? For the classics, action was important. For the spasmodics, expression was important. What is important for Matthew Arnold? And now you know the answer. Matthew Arnold was anti-spasmodics. So obviously he preferred action, and I have discussed this point earlier. Who was Matthew Arnold's model? You can see this modern guy with goggles, and you know that during the time of Shakespeare there wouldn't have been any specs like that, but now Shakespeare has specs, and he can see, he can visualize everything. He is still alive. Matthew Arnold was a great worshipper of Mr. William Shakespeare, and even Matthew Arnold wrote a sonnet on Shakespeare and worshipped Shakespeare. Others abide our question, thou art free, thou only smile, sip आप smile देते हो. And Matthew Arnold says that Shakespeare was such a figure whose name cannot be taken with reverence, with respect. He must be respected. But Matthew Arnold also talks about the defects of Shakespeare. शेक्सपियर की डिफेक्ट्स की भी बात करते हैं और कहते हैं कि to follow Shakespeare blindly is also not safe. It's very dangerous. There are certain qualities that are to be imitated, that are to be followed, but there are many that are not to be followed. Otherwise, you will not be a good poet. You will be a failure in the field of poetry. Shakespeare was not failure because Shakespeare was superhuman. He was genius. He is incomparable. But we cannot be Shakespeare. So imitation is good, but blind imitation is always bad. अंधभक्ति हमेशा खराब होती है. Shakespeare occurs to him as a name never to be mentioned without reverence. Never to be mentioned without reverence. You have to mention his name with reverence, means respect. Why? Because of his excellent subjects. And what were his excellent subjects? Matthew Arnold is happy that Shakespeare took the raw material from the classicals as well, and he based several of his plays on the classicals. He had no theory of choosing subjects of present import, finding his best in past times. He didn't have any theory, he didn't have any preference, and he knew well what constituted a poetical action, all which fitted in well with Arnold's conception of poetic greatness. These are the ideas, these are the points जिस पर आप किसी पोएट की जीनियसनेस और ग्रेटनेस को इवैल्यूएट कर सकते हो. And according to Matthew Arnold, Shakespeare possessed all the points, all those things that were required to be a genius, that were required to be a great poet. But there is a but. He has what struck Ben Jonson too, such an unbridled expression. Unbridled means uncontrolled, uniyantrit. His passion was uncontrolled, and that was bad. That was not good. Everything was good. His choosing of subject matter, his excellence, his action, everything was fine. He lacked, he had an unbridled expression, such a gift of happy phrase that he is unable to say anything plainly, even when the pressure of the accent demands the very directest language. इतना बड़ा दिमाग है शेक्सपियर के पास कि वो बहुत सिंपल सी चीज भी बहुत बड़े बड़े शब्दों में बताता है. He defied simplicity because he had so much power, he had so much knowledge that he could not control himself. That is unbridled passion. This was the weakness, though that was the greatness. But according to Matthew Arnold and according to Ben Jonson, the unbridled passion of a poet is always weak, and that weakness was with William Shakespeare. In spite of possessing, in spite of having all these qualities, Shakespeare had unbridled passion, and on that ground he is criticized by Ben Jonson as well as by Matthew Arnold. Arnold therefore did not consider Shakespeare a safe model for the Victorian poet. Shakespeare was not the safe model for the Victorian poet, and even according to Matthew Arnold, he was not a safe model for the Romantic poets as well. Mr. John Keats had imitated Shakespeare in writing a poem, Isabella or the Porta of Basile, और हुआ क्या उसका? Mr. Keats himself was not satisfied with the poem, and what did he say about that poem? I had told you in the previous lecture on John Keats, and I hope you would be remembering, and if you don't, then you have to watch that video again. Right, this is the reminder only. Whose weakness was the same, the more so because Shakespeare's own example was responsible for making this weakness fashionable in English poetry. Unbridled passion become fashionable in English poetry, and that is the contribution of William Shakespeare to English poets. From then, modern poet will learn how unspeakably superior is the effect of the one moral impression left by a great accent treated as a whole to the effect produced by the most striking single thought or by the happiest image. So one point that is very much clear here, Shakespeare, though he was great, he could not be followed blindly. He had his weakness, and that weakness is his unbridled passion, and that unbridled passion must be avoided. All right. Arnold's criterion of great poetry. How can a poetry be great? A poetry is great that gives joy even when the situation is painful. If you are watching a tragedy, if a writer is writing a tragedy, if a tragedy is being performed, it is supposed to give pleasure. This is the first quality, right? First criteria is to give joy even in uneven circumstances. Second thing, A great poetry is one that treats of action rather than thought. Action is more important for poetry, and the third point is that poetry pleases as a whole and not merely in parts. Right? As a whole, poetry must please, and if poetry is pleasing as a whole, not in part, then the poetry is great. And finally, poetry that is the highest models are the ancient classics, जिसके मॉडल क्लासिक्स हो, जो एज अ होल प्लेजर देने वाली हो, और जहां पर एक्शन इज प्रेफर्ड टू थॉट हो, और जहां पर जॉय इज प्रेफर्ड. These are the 4 points, 1, 2, 3, 4 points that can make a poetry great poetry. Classical subject matter, action is preferred, enjoyment is preferred, and finally it should please everyone as a whole, not in parts. Modern art and the old art, the grand style. Matthew Arnold talks about the grand style. What is grand style? There is no definition at all. He gives the example of the great style. And there are 3 types of grand style. Simple grand style, 2 ही type मान लेते हैं. Simple grand style and severe grand style. And according to Matthew Arnold, there are only 3 poets who followed the grand style, या who gave the grand style to the world. One is Homer, second is Dante, and third is Milton. Grand style, right? Grand style is something in the preface of 1853, Arnold had only alluded to the superiority of the grand style of the Greeks over the colorful style of the English. This is the colorful style of English. This is not the grand style of Greeks. In the lectures on translating Homer, he once again comes to the topic of the grand style, and he says that grand style, translating Homer, he offers grand style as a grand cure for a further evil creeping into English life and poetry, that is Americanism. Grand style is a thing that can save poetry, right? Grand style can save poetry from the evils that are entering into English poetry, and that evils into English poetry is called Americanism. Very important term. Americanism means mean in spirit, right? That is meanness of spirit, that is known as Americanism, and Matthew Arnold is against this Americanism. And what can save this Americanism from English poetry? That is the grand style. Grand style is the only style that can save English poetry. English poetry में colorful styles enter कर रही हैं, creep कर रही हैं, and that is a weakness, that is an evil, and this evil could be saved by reviving the grand style, right? And masters of grand style are Homer, Dante, and Milton. Homer is the example of simple grand style, and Milton is the example of severe grand style, and Dante is both. दोनों के example है. The effect of the grand style. What should be the effect of the grand style? Why grand style should be adopted? Because, as Matthew Arnold says, that it ennobles poetry and it ennobles life. It ennobles poetry and it ennobles life. How Homer achieves it is naturally the next question. How Homer achieved this ennobility? To Arnold, it appears to be the result of his rapidity of movement. These are the sources of grand style: rapidity of movement, plainness and directness of language, and nobility of nature, and simple lucidity of mind. Just write down these facts. What are the essentials? What are the basics of grand style? Matthew Arnold thinks that what makes Homer a great poet, what are the features of his grand style? क्यों grand style कहा जाए? Because Homer has the rapidity of movement, plainness and directness of language, nobility of nature, alright, nobility of nature, and simple lucidity of mind. Simple lucidity of mind. This is the first thing that makes Homer the progenitor of the grand style, effects of grand style. The grand style therefore arises in poetry when noble nature, poetically gifted, treats with simplicity or severity of a serious subject. There should be no compromise with the seriousness. As Aristotle had said, tragedy के definition में, it is an imitation of an action that is serious. That is serious, complete and of certain magnitude. Wordsworth is, Matthew Arnold is following him. Matthew Arnold had just said that poetry should be enjoyed as the whole, not in parts. यही Aristotle ने कहा था, it must be complete. Complete means it must have proper beginning, proper middle, proper end. Only then you could enjoy. Matthew Arnold is following him. Matthew Arnold is now following Homer's grand style. Once again, the classical writer, grand style ennobles life, it ennobles subject matter, it gives seriousness. Seriousness must be there, and that seriousness could be treated with simplicity or severity. Simplicity and severity, दोनों में से कोई भी हो, but subject must be serious. As Mr. Longinus said in his theory of sublime, grandeur of thought, capacity for strong emotion. And if thought is not grand, no epic, no poem could be grand. If thought is loose, if thought is not serious, if thought is not sublime, then language cannot do anything. Thought must be great, thought must be serious. English poets have failed to achieve grand style in their translations of Homer. Homer was translated by many poets, many writers, starting from Sir Henry Howard. He had translated 2 books, book number 2 and book number 4 of Aeneid. Right? Translator failed to achieve grand style in their translations of Homer. Non-English and non-Latin readers are advised to form an idea of the power and charm of the style of Homer and other poets of antiquity. From the poetry of Milton, who has the like power and charm because he has the like great style, that is grand style. Alright, grand style is fine. Grand style is the style of writing. It deals with the serious subject matter. It deals with the serious subject matter, and it arises in poetry when a noble nature, poetically gifted, treats with simplicity or severity a serious subject, and it ennobles poetry and it ennobles life. Right? It could be achieved through rapidity of movement, plainness of style, plainness and directness of language, nobility of nature, and simple and lucidity of mind. These are the features of the grand style. Alright, models of grand style is Homer. Right, model of grand style is Homer, and the next model is Dante, and then Milton. According to Arnold, Homer is the best model of grand style, simple grand style. Milton is the best model of severe grand style. Dante, however, is an example of severe and simple both. Even Chaucer, in Arnold's view, in spite of his virtues such as benignity, largeness, and spontaneity, lacks seriousness. Well published, well popularized, well asked phrase. Chaucer lacks high seriousness. Chaucer lacks high seriousness because he doesn't deal with the serious subject, and he doesn't have the grand style. He doesn't have that rapidity. He doesn't have that nobility. He doesn't have that seriousness. Chaucer lacks seriousness. And along with Chaucer, there is another poet who is mentioned by Matthew Arnold, that is Robert Burns. Robert Burns also lacks grand style, and he also lacks seriousness because he was hypocritical in that while he adopted a moral stance in some of his poems, in its private life he flouted morality. In his private life he flouted morality, and if you are flouting morality in your public life, you cannot preach morality. Two writers lacked seriousness according to Mr. Matthew Arnold, that is Geoffrey Chaucer, number one. Number two, Robert Burns. Robert Burns was a Scottish poet, and he is known as the national poet of Scotland. He is known as the plowman's poet, and he was criticized here on the ground of grand style. He didn't have the grand style. Alright, questions are fine, clear? Preface to poems of 1853. In this preface, he talked about the importance of architectonics. I had told you earlier that you will be meeting with architectonics in the next slides. Now you have architectonics. What are architectonics? Architectonics are that power of execution. You have grand subject, you have serious subject, you have nobility of diction, you are a master of figure of speech, you are the master of everything that requires a piece of literature. But if you are not a good executor, then your poetry can never be called great. And that is the importance of architectonics, importance of execution, that power of execution which creates, forms and constitutes in poetry the necessity of achieving unity by subordinating the parts to the whole, and the expression of ideas to the depiction of human action, and condemns poems which exist for the sake of single lines or passage, stray metaphors, images and fancy expressions. Such image, fancy expressions, right, single lines or striking passages, stray metaphors, they should not be there. What should be there? There should be necessity of unity of subordinating the parts to the whole. Whole is important, not the part. Execution is important, and the expression of ideas to the depiction of human action. Poetry is made of ideas, and ideas must be expressed, must be depicted, must depict human action, right? And stray metaphors, single lines, fancy expressions, unnecessary figures of speech, unnecessary architectonics must be avoided. He talked about this architectonics, the importance of architectonics in his preface to the poems. There must not be purple patches, right? The purple patches means there are seriousness at one place, and then at another place the poet lacks seriousness, right? The things are going in a very serious way, and triviality appears. So such mixtures, such purple patches cannot make a poem grand. Purple passages should be avoided. There must be an unity, right? Unity वहां पर होनी चाहिए. Scattered images and happy turns of phrase in his view, can only provide partial effects and not contribute to poetry. He, continuing his anti-romantic theme, urges modern poets to shun allusiveness and not fall into the temptation of subjectivity. He says that even the imitation of Shakespeare is risky for a young writer who should imitate only his excellences and avoid his attractive accessories. Attractive accessories क्या है? These are the part of architectonics. Attractive accessories are conceits, circumlocutions, quibbles, puns, allusiveness, right, which will lead a poet astray. Such parts of Shakespeare, such architectonics of Shakespeare must be avoided. His excellences should be imitated. And what are the excellences of Shakespeare? In the words of Matthew Arnold, Shakespeare के excellences क्या हैं? Just to see. Arnold comments Shakespeare's use of great plots from the past. Great plots from the past, from the classicals. Number one, what Goethe called the architectonic quality. Goethe was a French critic and poet. That is, his expression was matched to the accent for the subject. Execution. Execution, noble thoughts, noble ideas, serious thoughts, serious ideas, serious language. That is the execution. But at the same time, Matthew Arnold quotes another Victorian poet, Arthur Hallam, who had analyzed William Shakespeare to show that Shakespeare's style was complex even where the press of action demanded simplicity and directness, and hence his style could not be taken as a model for the young man. When action required simplicity, where action required directness, Shakespeare could not use that directness simply, but Shakespeare was very fond of puns, very fond of quibbles, and instead of writing something directly, he used circumlocution, and that's why Shakespeare should not be followed by a new poet, by the present poet. Elsewhere he says that Shakespeare's expression tends to become a little sensuous and simple, too much intellectualized. Shakespeare's sensuousness and simple, his expressions were too much intellectualized, and that too much intellectualism must be avoided, right? Simplicity should be retained. What were the excellencies of William Shakespeare? According to Matthew Arnold, the architectonic quality of his style, the harmony between action and expression. I hope you would have understood the meaning of tectonics. Architectonics का मतलब क्या है? The harmony between action and expression, harmony between idea and language, harmony between two things, unity between everything. Master Shakespeare's reliance on the ancients for his themes. This point also makes Shakespeare's excellent and accurate construction of action. Shakespeare was a dramatist, and Shakespeare's main focus was on action, and his accuracy makes him an excellent poet in the views of Matthew Arnold. And Shakespeare's strong conception of action and accurate portrayal of his subject matter. Shakespeare used the action according to the context, according to the subject matter. That is the grand style. His intense feeling for the subjects, he dramatizes. Whatever he dramatizes, he gave his intense feeling. That is the excellencies of Shakespeare. And what are his accessories that should be avoided by the contemporary poets, by the modern poets? वो accessories क्या है? His attractive accessories are tricks of style which a young writer should avoid, which a young writer should shun, should handle carefully. वो है his fondness for quibble, fancy and conceit. And this quibble, fancy and conceit were described by Dr. Samuel Johnson as the fatal Cleopatra. Dr. Samuel Johnson criticized Shakespeare's excessive use of quibbles, excessive use of pun, and Mr. Matthew Arnold also says that his quibble, his fancy and his conceits must be avoided, right? They should not be entertained by the contemporary writers. Shakespeare was the master of circumlocution, and that circumlocution, even where the press of accent demands directness, Shakespeare never comes to the point directly, but he comes through the long route circumlocution. That circumlocution should be avoided, and Shakespeare lacks simplicity, right? Very simple things also expressed in very complicated way, and this must be avoided by the modern writers. According to Hallam, his lack of simplicity should be avoided. And the last one, Shakespeare uses a lot of elusiveness, a lot of suggestiveness, and suggestiveness is the flaw of Shakespeare, and this flaw also must be avoided. Shakespeare's attractive accessories, his trick of style, Shakespeare's fondness for quibbles, puns, circumlocutions, and Shakespeare's lack of simplicity or Shakespeare's preference of complexity and Shakespeare's allusiveness must be avoided. Though Shakespeare was a person whose name can never be taken without reverence, without respect, but Shakespeare has also his defects, and his defects are counted by Mr. Matthew Arnold, and these defects must be shunned, must be avoided by one and all, right? जो भी मैथ्यू अर्नल्ड की बात को मानते हों. All right, कोई confusion, कोई problem, any problem, any confusion? Mr. Matthew Arnold now gives the example of the imitation. Boccaccio's story of Isabella was imitated by Keats. Boccaccio was a successful poet, and Keats failed in the depiction in imitating Isabella or the Pot of Basil. Keats had borrowed the story from Boccaccio's Decameron, right? वहां से उन्होंने story लिया, but Keats uses felicitous phrases and single happy turns of phrase, yet the action is handled vaguely, and so the poem does not have unity. By way of contrast, he says the Italian writer Boccaccio handled the same theme successfully in his Decameron because he rightly subordinated expression to action. Subordinated expression to action, and Keats subordinated action to expression. Keats failed and Boccaccio succeeded. Hence, Boccaccio's poem is a poetic success, where Keats is a failure. Alright? Now, I come to the function of criticism. Alright? Lecture बड़ा हो रहा है, और बड़ा हो रहा है, बड़ा होने दीजिए. बड़ी चीजें बड़ी ही होती हैं, बड़ी चीजें बड़ी होती हैं, और बड़ा काम करने के लिए बड़ी बड़ी वीडियो आपको देखना पड़ेगा. वैसे नेक्स्ट क्लास में कहिए ये वीडियो दे देंगे आपको इसके आगे, द फंक्शन ऑफ क्रिटिसिज्म, और फिर हम द स्टडी ऑफ पोएट्री पर आएंगे. देन यू विल हैव 3 वीडियोज on Matthew Arnold. Alright, I wind up here for the sake of my students, for the sake of your convenience. You will be छोड़िए, राइट? यहीं पर क्लोज करते हैं. नेक्स्ट वीडियो इसी के आगे से आ जाएगी. एंजॉय करिएगा, मस्त रहिएगा, वीडियो देखिएगा, कई बार देखिएगा, फिर से फॉलो करिएगा हमको, शेयर भी करिएगा, चैनल सब्सक्राइब भी करिएगा. आपका ही चैनल है, और आप जितना सब्सक्राइब कर लेंगे, जितना लोगों को शेयर कर देंगे, उतने लोगों को बेनिफिट होने वाला है. ऑल द बेस्ट, गुड लक. मिलते हैं जल्दी फंक्शन ऑफ क्रिटिसिज्म के साथ. थैंक यू.